everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from BT, The Secret Language of Trees. So, how are we feeling about BT these days? Now, I think it's pretty clear from all the videos I've made on this guy over the years that BT is one of my personal favorite artists of all time. And he still remains a massive inspiration on me to this day, from his commercial trance work going as far back as the mid-90s that consistently shows him making the effort to keep up with the times and the newest innovations in technology without sacrificing his clear passion for music making. With several stone-cold classics such as ESCM, Movement and Still Life, and These Hopeful Machines that remain essential favorites for whatever generation of dance music fans were there to see them as they were new. Always pretty ahead of the curve, and occasionally even trend-setting in his own right, as seen with his pioneering stutter edit techniques in the early 2000s, to his various downtempo and IDM excursions that show him carving out his own niche within those genres that he can call his own, and entirely lean away from his most commercial tendencies. This guy's had so many projects that have meant so much to me. His 2006 album, This Binary Universe, I've obviously previously marked as my second favorite of all time in any genre, and one of the few projects in existence to earn a score of a perfect 10 out of 10 for me. And I will continue to argue that he's never fully lost his touch, with albums as recent as Everything You're Searching For Is on the Other Side of Fear from 2019, and The Lost Art of Longing from 2020 that sit right alongside his best ever work. With that said, as much amazing work as he's done, he can be very frustrating to follow. He's very much the kind of artist who cares just as much about making bank as he does about the actual craft of music, who believes in the systems and attitudes of capitalism and is more than happy to play into them for good and ill, who had a bad habit of overhyping his work on social media to the point of making a few claims about his work that weren't entirely accurate, such as 2 separate albums which he mistakenly advertised to be an hour longer than they actually were, or all the unfulfilled and overreaching promises left over from the Electronic Opus Kickstarter. To be fair, I suspect you can mostly blame the latter point on that project's co-producer Tommy Tellerico. H-Bomber Guy made an excellent video on that guy's way scummier track record if you're curious, but I digress, and I don't know if BT's hands are exactly clean on that one either. All my biggest frustrations with BT eventually came to a head on his last album in 2021, Metaversal, a middle-of-the-road synthwave album that BT threw together out of his burning passion for the then-booming culture of cryptocurrency and NFTs, an album which he entirely composed on a blockchain. And I am still not over how freaking stupid that was. Way too many electronic artists may have jumped on the NFT bandwagon to list, but BT was the only one who made an entire goddamn album about them, dedicated to promoting their existence and the culture around them for its own sake. And it was unbelievably painful to watch as it was happening. Guy had legit become more of a crypto bro than a musician for a while. Even on all of BT's previous sellout moves, it was always clear that he put a lot of effort into everything he did and deeply cared about the music he was making, no matter how commercial and trendy it was. But that was the first moment in his catalog where it felt like the music itself was taking a backseat. For that album cycle, BT clearly cared a lot more about the NFT integration than he did the actual contents of the album, which went for an improvisational approach that basically just boiled down to delivering his most rushed, half-baked, and uninteresting set of compositions that leaned entirely away from his actual strengths as an artist. I don't think I've ever been more actively upset or angry while writing and recording a video than my review of that album. One of my all-time favorite artists was seemingly throwing away his passion for music for the sake of a trendy scam, and in such a way that still, unfortunately, lined up with the way he typically operates. It almost made me feel like a little bit of a chump for all the years I spent hyping him up myself, and I could no longer blame any of the people who'd given up on him and his music over the years for whatever applicable reasons. But at the same time, it didn't actually result in my giving up on him. It didn't substantially impact my enjoyment of any of his previous albums, and he had far too much goodwill built up for one bad album to burn that all down. And to be absolutely fair, Metaversal as an album removed from context isn't the worst thing ever. It has its fair share of defenders who had no problem enjoying it, and I totally understand them too. Like, the actual music on that album isn't actually objectionable beyond just being kind of dull and watered down. It had a few decent to good moments, plus there were easy means to get into or support that album without getting your hands dirty in the crypto world, thanks to, being available on all the normal streaming services. So no shame on the people who actually did like it. Additionally, I'd always kept in mind that as passionless as that particular album came off, a guy who always puts that much passion and effort into all his other music isn't just gonna let all of that disappear overnight. The crypto market is nowhere even close to as much of a public concern now as it was 2 years ago, and even if BT hasn't left that world and still has Web3 founder in his Twitter bio, that is neither accurate nor something to be proud of. And he has admitted to using blockchain technology for some minor elements on this latest album as well, mostly visuals, I believe. But at the very least, that kind of stuff is clearly no longer his main focus, and he doesn't post about it nearly as much as he did before. He's finally back to making music for the sake of his love for making music. Also, there's another unrelated shiny new technology which captured his interest more and allowed as a much-needed distraction from the crypto world. As it appears, this latest album was inspired by the recent leaps forward in the world of AI and machine learning. Now, I'll admit that AI in itself is something that I have mixed feelings on. That is another technology that is being used in a lot of really unethical ways that are making the world worse. But unlike crypto, where I couldn't even see what the upside was beyond being a shallow and disingenuous get-rich-quick scheme, when it comes to, AI, diffusion engines, that kind of stuff, I don't think the new technology itself is the problem. I still view it as a tool that can be used for good or ill, and have seen applications of it I thought were cool or promising. The way I see it, what people are generally referring to as AI these days is basically just a new, more advanced form of sampling, taking external data from images and audio and whatnot and reconstructing it atom by atom into something new that credibly resembles the source from which it was made, but repurposed into a new context. Now, I'm very pro-sampling. My own music as 256pi is primarily cut together out of externally sourced royalty-free sample packs. My earliest success on the internet was through YTPs, which cut together a bunch of copyrighted material to transform them into something different, without permission from the rights holders of the source material, and without making money on them. It's stuff like this which is why I don't actually take any moral issue with people using new AI tech in a vacuum. The problem is obviously a lot more, with big corporations taking the cue of its existence to do massive amounts of data harvesting and using AI as a way to cut costs, using the newness of a tech as an excuse for stepping over the work of artists the models are trained on, without giving said artists the financial means to survive. If you want more detailed thoughts on the topic, there's a really good Jack Saint video that basically expresses all the same feelings on AI that I have. So when BT is making posts about how he feels there is a bright future within the new leaps forward in machine learning, so long as it's actually used ethically, which is a distinction he made himself, that's perfectly reasonable to me. He's even made the same comparisons to sampling that I just did. Granted, while I know he has used machine learning and generative techniques while making this latest album, that's not really going to come into play when I talk about the music itself. I'm not even entirely sure to what specific extent he used it. The Secret Language of Trees got me excited purely because this is his latest entrant into his This Binary Universe series of purely abstract IDM and downtempo albums, of which he is advertising as the 7th installment. Apparently he's retconned his fully ambient albums, Nuovo Merso Sabrosa and Between Here and You, to be a part of that series, which I personally always viewed to be something different before, but I guess their inclusion within the series makes enough sense for me to let it slide. Perhaps that might not be the best sign for the people who haven't been feeling his most recent ambient works, but it might be more exciting to hear that The Secret Language of Trees is very specifically the closest a new entrant in this series has come to recreating the style of the first This Binary Universe. You know, the one I scored a 10. People who wanted their fix of the more complex and high-detail IDM side of BT are finally gonna get their proper fill with this album. And not only that, this isn't a case like Underscore where there were 3 tracks that lived up to the scale of the first TBU and all the other tracks around it were either regular ambient pieces or borderline unfinished fragments. This album sees every track trying to have that greater scale and level of detail as stuff on the first TBU, or at least the stuff on If the Stars Are Eternal, with all 10 tracks feeling much more comparable in importance to each other. It's much more like the experience I thought I was going to get out of Underscore back when BT first announced that was going to be a thing and dropped Artifacture as a single. By the way, when I am talking about the tracks on this album, I'll be specifically referring to the producer's cut versions of all of them. Those are clearly the manner in which BT originally envisioned them to be digested. There is also an original version of the album which cuts the whole track listing down to about 45 minutes if you want to speedrun it or something. But come on now, this is a BT album. This guy's always better when he goes longer. If there's a version of this album that stretches on for 100 minutes like this one, that is automatically the version I'm getting. I know for a fact he's going to make that time worth my while. And the edited versions and producer's cut versions are all gathered together in the same digital release anyway, so it's not like one's more easily accessible than the other. But yeah, when I first heard this album, I was like, hell yes, I love all of this. This is one of his absolute best albums in years. Maybe even his best since These Hopeful Machines. This is just BT focusing on the kind of stuff that I specifically love the most in his work. It's practically made for someone like me. With a few more repeat listens, I was less sure about the loftiness of those comparisons. I mean, one sticking point that I had with this album, like immediately on first listen and never went away, is that the sequencing on this project feels a tiny bit arbitrary. I agree with the Turing test being the opener, but there's not a lot of rhyme or reason to the way the other tracks are ordered. They're thematically similar enough with the tracks tending to feel more like standalone islands, where this point doesn't get in the way as much as it could. I mean, you could theoretically order the album in whatever way you want. But it does take away from the album feeling like as much of it as a cohesive whole as it could. Especially when there's 2 tracks here that feel like really obvious choices for album closers that would have been perfect clinchers to the album in their own separate ways. And the track he actually chose to close the album, Depth of Field, feels more like it should be like a filler deep cut. Even though an album like If the Stars Are Eternal technically gives you less to chew on than this album did, the way all its individual pieces came together feels way more natural and cohesively structured. Each part on that album is clearly adding up to something greater, which does lead to me feeling like that album still beats this one out. In addition, one other point that had me wavering on this album is that I didn't really feel like it offered that much in the way of new ideas that I hadn't already heard in previous installments of this series. A lot of tracks here feel like they have fairly obvious parallels to other specific old tracks of his, which I'll get to as I break all of them down. An album like Other Side of Fear, as stripped back and minimalistic as it was clearly doing its own thing that none of his other albums were, not just through the instrumental palette, but also through the way sadder and more melancholy tone to the whole thing, both of which in themselves made that whole album feel more cohesive. Granted, after listening to both in closer proximity to each other, I'd probably just barely give this the edge over that album too. This album has plenty of moments that are able to hit on an equally deep emotional level while feeling even more in-depth and substantial. Also, for all my nitpicks on this album sequencing, Other Side of Fear might actually have it worse, having not just a similarly arbitrary closer, but an even weaker, slower start. It's very much a middle-loaded album, and that's not ideal. For as often as this album can feel like it's directly trying to recreate the magic of specific old moments in his catalog, most of the time he is pretty easily able to match those moments in terms of the actual quality on display, and maybe even possibly improve upon them in a few cases. Take the opener, the Turing test. This track stretches on for nearly 19 minutes and feels like an attempt to recapture the magic of his track Artifacture. And honestly, I think it turned out even better than Artifacture. They start out more or less the same way, with big expansive ambient pads and waves of granular noise washing over the entire mix, accentuated by strings and synthesized vocal pads. Also mirroring how Artifacture took very minor ambient elements from his old track The Emergency, this track takes minor ambient elements from his track Suddenly in its opening seconds. The track starts to take a bit of a different turn later, with some light-tapping percussion joining windier string pads and eventually building into a progression of bell melodies with electric pianos that openly resemble tracks of his like 1.618 and Dynamic Symmetry. There's these metallic harp-like sounds introduced at one point that kind of remind me of the electric harp Andreas Vollenweider plays. All of this is amazing and has lots of fantastic build-up as if I'm experiencing a track from the original This Binary Universe brand new for the first time. But the real kicker of this track happens right around the 8.5 minute mark, where the beats suddenly go double time and the entire mix turns into an experimental drum and bass flavored cut, shooting off at high speed, paying off fantastically without sacrificing the more subtle and mysterious nocturnal atmosphere that the whole This Binary Universe series is known for carrying. The track does have an especially long outro throughout pretty much its entire last 6-7 minutes or so, as all the tapping percussion is left to very gradually slow down as if you just spun a bicycle wheel and left it up to natural friction in the air for it to stop. Also, lots of the ambient pads and effects from the beginning join back in and sound absolutely beautiful. This is exactly the kind of track that I still come to BT for. This would fit perfectly alongside the track listing of This Binary Universe and even be one of the better tracks on that album. And yeah, it is probably my favorite track on the album as well, but not actually by much. Good Evening Mrs. Lovelace is next, and this track admittedly was not one I was particularly impressed by on first listen. It doesn't have nearly as many moving parts as the opener. It goes for a much more subtle approach driven by nothing but light tapping percussion and BT's minimal piano performances. Maybe a few extra synth arpeggios in the background through the second half, but that's it, really. Not really much in the way of progression over its 8.5 minutes. It's kind of like the Boulez Inquiry from Other Side of Fear, if the focus was put more on the piano instead of the percussion. But if there's anything that Other Side of Fear proved, is that BT absolutely has the capability to keep me invested with an unaccompanied solo piano performance, and this is probably a more captivating composition than anything on that album. There's a bit of a delicate but playful bounce to the melodies that delivers just enough of a hook for me to fairly easily recall what the track sounds like, but they still primarily aim to feel very warm and enveloping. And the way they go up next to the constantly shifting rhythms of the tapping percussion seem to evoke, sitting next to a fireplace with a cup of hot chocolate and hearing the fire safely crackling next to you. On first listen, it was my least favorite due to its relative simplicity, but significantly grew on me every subsequent time I put it on. Now, if you're looking for the more complex side of BT again, he very much delivers that on K-means clustering. This was the album's only promotional single, and immediately after I heard it for the first time, I was like, oh damn, if the whole album's like this, he will have fully won me back. Over the course of just under 8 minutes, this track evolves from evocative violin pads to mysterious individual piano notes and chords, to glitching all those elements up with more light granular percussion, further building and enveloping you, switching up its chord progression to something that feels much deeper and bassier, eventually even bringing in stronger dance beats to give the whole mix some more pulse, also switch up into more post-rocky guitars, and drums going up next to old-school dubstep wubs, going back to the violins for a second and letting the string arrangements get more dynamic, more sections with the deeper pianos and dance beats and guitar progression. Seemingly every second in this track is throwing a new idea at you in the proper original This Binary Universe style. And man, am I glad that it was chosen as a single because it was actually an indicative tone setter for what to expect out of the album, and not because it was the one that would get the people the most excited. There's at least 2 or 3 more tracks later in the track listing that I haven't mentioned yet that I liked even more. Following track Meet Her in the Mines is admittedly not one of those. I mean, when I first saw the title of this one, I was like, oh, mines. What kind of mining would you happen to be talking about, BT? Before getting a little depressed again. But this track is still really freaking nice. It's another track that kind of focuses on simple piano improvisations going over minimal percussion with not much progression over the course of exactly 10 minutes. Although this one is a completely different feel from Good Evening Mrs. Lovelace. The pianos, first of all, have a lot more of a weird and watery digital affect to them. Possibly an AI thing, I don't know. And they're surrounded by a lot more chilling pads, light glitches, and a few string washes that evoke exploring some kind of mysterious underground passageway. The title referring to an actual mine shaft feels like it would be appropriate. Although it's just as subtly comforting as everything else here, fittingly as if you were to meet someone you love within said mines. And I guess maybe I lied when I said there was no progression. The pianos and percussion mostly go away in the last 3 minutes in place of glitching up really subtle electric pianos and synth blips for an even more subtle experience. I mean, it's not a track that would stick out to me on every listen or one I'd mark as a major favorite, but it still definitely pulled me in quite well for what it was going for. If you want one of the big major favorites, though, the 10-minute Berlin is acting as a sort of album centerpiece. On the speedrun version of the album, it's only cut down to 7 minutes, which means you can tell this one meant something special to him. And boy, does he deliver. I mean, in terms of the instrumental texture, there's very little to it. It's almost entirely solo piano, and the accompaniment from the occasional glitches in percussion or light bass lines are mostly kept to a minimum. But the piano performance itself is where all the impressive complexity is going. The track has so much dynamic range, different shifts in tempo, and interesting interplay between the chords themselves, really starting to pick up more classical and jazz influence later on, and eventually starting to take on the same kind of energy as the slowest and most subtle parts of, like, George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, especially in the second half. As all the percussion and other accompaniment goes away entirely aside from field recordings of Rain, it just hits emotionally like a ton of bricks. Also, since this is BT, the field recordings get the entire last minute to themselves, which is nice. I mean, this is such an exceptionally pretty cut. I really don't have much words for it, almost kinda needs to be heard to be believed. I wouldn't have minded if this were the album closer, but the halfway point works just as well. And there's another really big favorite immediately after that with Deepfake, notable for being the most straightforwardly danceable track on display here, acting as a follow-up to old tracks of his like 739, Yahweh, or Orthogonal, or The Uncanny Valley, the one track from Metaversal I actually liked. Another especially warm and evocative mix of string pads introduces a very standard but foot-tapping dance beat going up next to some especially deep and heavy bass lines and various plinky and dreamlike keyboard loops. And while the track doesn't exactly reveal any new sides to itself from there beyond maybe one lower-key electric piano side track as a build-up and an outro where it feels like every element of the mix melts together into a single glitchy pad, the whole thing just has this really nice chill groove and intriguing melody to it that keeps me well invested the whole time. Quite easily makes 7 minutes feel like it goes by in like 3 minutes. And speaking of which, next up there's Time Moves So Fast, another track that fittingly feels shorter than the near 8-minute length might have you expecting. To be fair, there are definitely some textures here which don't appear anywhere else on the album. The Bulgarian choir that prominently appears in a number of moments throughout the track makes it especially stick out in my mind. Although a lot more of the track is focusing on granular percussion workouts and a few like keyboard licks and warm guitars that have an especially heartfelt flavor to them. I guess if Deepfake was meant to mirror 739 from If the Stars Are Eternal, then this track kind of mirrors the track from that album right after it, Hikari. Hitting a similar emotional note. Also, there's a lot of neat, thicker, 80s funk-flavored synth-bass textures running through a few parts, which are a nice touch. But if you thought that track was heartfelt, it's nothing compared to the following track, Embers, the result of BT directly trying to make a spiritual successor to Good Morning Kaya. And fuck is it so good. Second best track behind the opener and might be the best if I'm in the right mood. It doesn't sound exactly like Good Morning Kaya. The pianos aren't really delivering the chord hook like on that track so much as they are acting as the underlying chord progression. Also, the tempo on this track is a lot more brisk and energetic. You're not gonna mistake the two tracks for each other. But they do pull the exact same move of having the big post-rock build-up and climax to equally as strong effect. Starting out simple with just pianos, light drumming, and clock-ticking noises, building up to a thicker mix with heavier drumming and some descending electric piano arpeggios, and finally paying off gloriously with all the crashing drums and guitar distortion. Legit makes me tear up every damn time. If I have any complaint with this track, I do wish it were longer, or at least lingered a bit more on that heaviest moment. The track is ostensibly just under 7 minutes, but the last minute or so is just an outro of like one percussion texture slowing down and fading out very slowly, so the core of it is more like 5.5 minutes. I absolutely would not have minded stretching that out more. But maybe a more pressing issue with this track is, why the hell isn't this the album closer? It feels so ready-made to be like the big epic clincher to the entire adventure this album took you on and the big emotional heavy hitter to cap things off. If you're gonna make something this directly comparable to Good Morning Kaya, why not go all the way with it and make it serve the same purpose in greater album context as that which it aims to spiritually succeed? It absolutely had the ability to. It feels like such an obvious pick for that spot. And yet instead we get two more tracks after it, which are, quite frankly, the two weakest tracks in the bunch. Okay, it's not like these are bad tracks, or that I would want them cut out altogether, but neither are standouts, and both are made worse by having to follow up a big emotional moment like Embers. Kia Ora is a track I wanted to say was a standout, with it stretching out over 16 minutes, clearly a big epic centerpiece moment that's meant to really stick out, but it doesn't actually live up to the epicness that length seems to imply. It's another track that kind of sticks to one core groove without having much in the way of interesting progressions or textures. There are some nice melodic arpeggios running through it that make for a decent hook, some cool round 80s bass lines, more well-detailed minimal IDM percussion workouts in the same vein as earlier cuts here like Meter in the Mines that add up to a decent enough groove that allows for a solid sense of momentum. It doesn't drag or overstay its welcome despite being over twice as long as any of the 3 tracks that came before it. But it doesn't feel as striking or memorable or evocative as any of those moments. At best, this acts as like an extended credits roll kind of moment for the album, or in an alternate universe it could serve as like a build-up to a greater emotional hype provided by a following track. Alas, the actual closer here, Depth of Field, as mentioned before, is not that emotional height. In fact, it's the least substantive or interesting cut in the bunch and my least favorite out of all 10 tracks on display here. Which is to say it's still pretty good. I mean, the higher pitched pads and keyboard licks have a much more light, sunny, and uplifting texture to them, creating a lot of nice effect out of its negative space before any bass joins in, here provided by individual electric piano notes and some string pads. It kind of works in the same way something you might hear out of like an outfit like Carbon-Based Lifeforms. I guess it doesn't not work as a closer, but it's just kind of an anticlimax way to finish. It really would have benefited from trading places in the track listing with Embers again. That was the obvious pick for the closer. This would have made more sense as a filler deep cut, but I guess we got what we got. But that's everything on The Secret Language of Trees. Yeah, no, I can't front. BT pretty easily won me back with this one. This was absolutely my shit. Is it the kind of thing that I can easily recommend to everyone? Don't know. It depends on how much you're in the mood for him to make even more downtempo and IDM material. I have seen a number of people say they've gotten sick of him doing this kind of thing. If that's your stance, then feel free to skip it. I don't think this is going to win him any new fans that weren't already converted by previous entrants in his This Binary Universe series. And obviously, if people just want to move on from BT and not give him the time of day anymore, yeah, I will 100% feel you there. Even as a diehard fan, I've put up with a lot of bullshit from him over the years. And it's not even the best album I've heard in this particular style this year. I mean, if you haven't heard the Reed Willis album, Sediment, I'd highly recommend that. It's a much darker, more bombastic and tighter album than this, but hit some similar notes in a bunch of spots and hit me on an even deeper level in this. But with all that aside, yeah, I still love this enough where it'll be a likely year-end list contender anyway. Shit like this is the whole reason I considered BT one of my all-time favorite artists in the first place. The Secret Language of Trees was obviously never going to be as good as the first This Binary Universe. Each track on that album adds something specific to the table with no redundancy, is sequenced in the exact order to make all 7 tracks hit with the greatest possible impact, while also going significantly deeper with the level of complexity and granular detail. As far as I'm concerned, he's never going to be able to top it. This album in comparison feels like a reconstructed version of ideas that came before. One could even say it's like the result of a particularly advanced diffusion engine that used BT's other abstract IDM material as training data. But again, that's how it feels in comparison to my second favorite album of all time, and it's worth noting that there's still several moments on this album that were successfully able to hit the same heights as the stuff on that album. This project has all the same crazy attention to detail, out-of-the-box ideas that are so easily recognizable as his signature style, and most importantly, the deeper emotional core that his best material always has. The worst moments here are still pretty solid, and the best moments go toe-to-toe with some of the best tracks BT's ever made, especially the Turing Test and Embers. If I were to place it in the worst-to-best ranking I made back before Metaversal dropped, after much deliberation, I think I'd put this right above Other Side of Fear and right below Movement and Still Life. It's unlikely to go down as a classic like the latter, but it's more stuff that sounds just like his best album and does that sound comparably as well. The closest he's ever come to directly recapturing the success of that first TBU, and I'm more than happy to eat that right up. It's not likely to win everyone over, but in my eyes, this is a successful bounce back. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.